Right. Some of you may know James. In fact, I suspect most of you do.
No.
I want to keep it that way.
So, James Linford, he's going to talk to us tonight on the Battle of Orra. Over to you.
Thank you. I've heard of a hard act to follow, but I've never had an occasion of a hard act to precede. I'm very conscious of the need for brevity, and I'm reminded of the eminent professor who was invited to lecture to Yale University to give the keynote address. And he chose as his theme YALE, Youth, Academia, Learning and Education, and then proceeded to speak for 40 minutes on each of the topics. When he eventually sat down, the Dean of Yale was heard to say he was mightily glad that the professor was not addressing the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So, brevity, the order of the day. I will not detain you long. Why, may you ask, am I interested in the Battle of Orra? Well, I walk the North Antrim Hills a great deal, and I'm fascinated by what's out there, geology, geography, flora, fauna, bird life, and the history of the place. And up there is steeped in it. And I dug into this battle, which fascinated me. And tonight what I'll do is talk about it really in two slightly different contexts. And I guess many of you, well, hands up who's never heard of it. Oh, there are people who don't. Okay. Hands up who knows all about it. Right, okay, while we're on the question, are there any McDonald's in the room? O'Neill's? McQuillan's? Ah, right. Then I'll have to be careful about what I say. Right, I'm fascinated by this battle because where it sits in history. So I'm going to talk about the wider context of the battle, and then I want to get down into the weeds and talk a bit more about the military bits, because I'm ex-army and that fascinates me. So putting it in its proper context, 1583. Before I move on, there are actually some archives which say that it was later than that. But the archive in the National Archive in Dublin clearly identifies the death of one of the protagonists around about this period. And so I'm pretty clear in my own mind, this date is correct. And for a reason I'll talk about right at the very end, I think you'll probably agree with me. Well, why, may you ask, is she up there? Well, at the time, Elizabeth was the Queen of England, and England and Wales was one nation. Scotland, of course, was an entirely separate nation, with originally Mary, Queen of Scots, and later James VI of Scotland on the throne. Ireland had been established as a kingdom by Henry VIII, but was effectively a colony, for want of a better expression, of England. And the way that the Elizabethan administration ran Ireland, or governed Ireland, sorry.
Can you just talk a bit slower?
Yeah.
That's easier.
The way that they governed Ireland was to effectively leave the old clans, the old historical clans, to conduct their business pretty much as they had done for many years before the English ever came along. But they added a subtle twist to it. It was very much a case of divide and rule. They would get a clan to swear allegiance to the Queen, then give them grants of land and titles and all sorts, which then encouraged that particular clan to say to the adjoining clans, well, we're in charge here, and we're going to rule the roost. But then they would do the same thing with another clan. End up with clans fighting each other, which meant that the English really didn't have to bother. And on the few occasions when the English put a standing army out on the ground, it got thumped by the Irish. So it didn't suit them. And the Earl of Sussex, who was the Lord Deputy at the beginning of the period, was particularly adept at this. And you will hear some more about this in just a second. Let's focus, this by the way is roughly a historical map of the time. Let's focus up here in this, well that won't show, hang on, oops, go back. Thank you. Up here, this area here, which is obviously where we are. Now, why was this of interest to anybody? And who ruled the roost during the 1500s? Well, this piece of land here was then known as Clannaboy, later Clandeboy, which was the fiefdom of one of the bands of the O'Neill clan, one of the branches. A little further north was this area here, which is the area between, effectively, Coleraine and up as far as, Ballycastle. Why was that of interest? Well, all of this land over here was not considered by anybody to be of any particular value. This was the most fertile land around and about, which was why it was of interest. And the O'Neills, who stemmed from right down here, huge clan, with many branches to it, extended all the way up. And at the time that I'm coming into, you had the O'Neills of Eden, Derry, Duff, Carrick. And I'm not going to say that again tonight because we know it better as Shane's Castle. They were a smaller branch of the O'Neill clan, and they ruled the roost up here alongside their kin, the McQuillans, who were very, very important in the area. Now, what upset the apple cart was the arrival from Islay, across 17 miles of the North Channel, the MacDonald, who set up shop around Ballycastle and Dunluce. Just by being there, they posed a threat to the O'Neills. And over time, there were issues. Oops, go on. Thank you, go on. Why is my thing not in there? Thank you. That's the route as it was then known. And it's of no particular interest, but I came across the fact that the area between the van and the bush was also known as the Boys. In somewhere around about 1560, and the date is not fixed, I said 1558, but it's somewhere around about then. Unlike most of the other clan chiefs, who if they swore allegiance to Queen Elizabeth, did it in Dublin in front of the Lord Deputy, Shane O'Neill, who was head of the Shane's Castle branch of the clan, actually went all the way to London and swore in front of the Queen. So you can imagine that he must have considered himself on his return to be anointed in a way that many of the others were not. And he really ruled the roost for quite a while. After a time, he decided that he didn't like having the MacDonald hovering just across the river. So he went to turn them out. And there was a battle in 1565 at Glentasy, which is a little bit further south than where eventually the Battle of Orra was fought, and on very different ground. And the O'Neills prevailed massively. They completely defeated the O'Neills, the MacDonalds. And the only MacDonald hope was that one of the clan, Alistair, came coming across from Scotland, but he arrived too late with reinforcements, couldn't find a landing ground, and went back. So the rest of the MacDonalds were put in the bag. The head of the clan, James MacDonald, died of his wounds a matter of days after the battle, and so the headship, the chieftain fell on Sawley Boy MacDonald, about whom most of you will have heard, I guess. He became the chief, but he was in prison at the time. Now please don't ask me to pronounce his Gaelic name, but what I did discover in digging around is the English knew him as this, Somerled of the Yellow Hair. Somerled is an old Norse word for warlord or chieftain. Yellow hair suggests to me that he was blonde, though perhaps from this illustration, which is supposedly of him, you wouldn't think so. But for the next 2 years, he was a prisoner of Shane O'Neill. And this is where he developed certain skills that I don't think people are aware of. He was known as a warlord, yes, but he then became quite a diplomat and quite a negotiator. He did better even than that. Not only did he sweet-talk Shane O'Neill until they became quite friendly, he actually married an O'Neill, a kinswoman of Shane from Tannerboy. So he married into the O'Neills. And in 1567, the situation between them was such that he was released from captivity. And to celebrate the event, he invited Shane O'Neill and some of his lead chieftains to a party in Cushendun, where they stabbed him to death and his followers, which is, the sort of treason you really can do without. Anyway, on the back of this, Sawley Boy legged it back to Scotland. And over the next 10 years or so, he came back and forth, but really did nothing more than that. except for one thing. And I don't know how he did this, but somehow he made his way to Dublin and swore his allegiance to Queen Elizabeth and had got a grant of lands which included most of the route. Now that knowledge must have reached the O'Neills. Now Shane was dead, he was replaced by a cousin called Hugh MacPhailin O'Neill, and he clearly harboured, understandably harboured, quite a grudge against Boy for having killed his kinsman, and the fact that having defeated them once, there they were back again with some sort of patronage from the reigning sovereign. This is the period 1567 to around about 1580. Boy went back to Scotland again, and he returned one more time, and this time on landing he swore never to leave Ireland, and he didn't. But he also brought with him a fairly sizable force, about which I shall say more in just a moment. This is an extract from a poem, The Battle of Orra, by a guy called James Stoddard Moore, better known as Dusty Rhodes, the poet of the Glens. And I've included it because he wrote this, he was around about, somewhere about 1914, 15, that sort of time. And he wrote this. Now, obviously, he had no access to Wikipedia like me. So where he got his information from, I don't know. But this is interesting, not just because the whole poem tells a story, this is just an extract from it, but it's written in the vernacular of the time in a way. So it's quite interesting. Anyway, it tells the story. And the Macquillans, along with their king, the O'Neills, were starting to get ready to eventually take on the MacDonalds. But it gives you an idea of how far their influence extended. So when they all get together, what are the force levels? Okay, well, over on the left-hand side, we've got Boy, and he brought with him 600 red shanks, and I'll say something more about red shanks in just a moment. Ignore these two clads for a minute, because they play a part later on, but not just now. They're tucked down there on my slide, because I couldn't put them anywhere else. So going over the other side, we see Hugh O'Neill, and he's got cavalry. MacDonald has not. Say something more about cavalry in a minute. And then we've got Rory MacQuillan and his brother Edward, and they are kin, they are allies to O'Neill. And they've got a couple of minor clans on side as well. And then the basis, the real meat of their army is this. 2 companies of Gallagher heavy infantry, about which I shall say some more in just a moment, and 2 companies of what are called English shot. And they were sent up, they're all over the page, they were sent up with this guy, and if you don't know what a seneschal is, it's basically a warden or sort of keeper. And so he obviously worked for another O'Neill. On the face of it, that's a pretty mighty force. So I think Hugh O'Neill must have felt, along with Rory MacQuillan, that they had much the upper hand. Not only that, but they remembered the last time they met the MacDonalds at Glen Taisy, they defeated them completely and relatively quickly. On top of which, they are fired up by the fact that of the treason or the treachery of Boy in killing Shane O'Neill. So the ground is set for some sort of an engagement. But let's talk about the component parts. What were Gallo Glass infantry? They were Irish mercenaries. And these guys had held sway right across Ireland for many, many, many years. They were, as I say, mercenaries, so they're in it for the money. They're not in it for the cause. They hawk themselves around from clan to clan. They are professional soldiers. And at a time when most Elizabethan men were only about 5'6", these guys were closer to 6 foot and big. And they carried the lot into battle. They had a sword, a shield, an axe, and a halberd, or pike. So they were heavy. And their method of fighting was to fight closed up, shoulder to shoulder, and simply defeat their opponents by sheer weight and sheer weight of numbers. So they were very formidable. The trouble is, in a way, that they hadn't evolved their tactics at all, and this played a part in what happened subsequently. I mentioned cavalry. When I talk about cavalry normally, people have visions of guys in ritzy uniforms riding horses like Nijinsky and Shergar and dashing across the plain and slashing people with their swords. And that's not what these were. These were guys on little, squat, stocky ponies, very lightly armed. For the most part, they were used for reconnaissance or flank protection. In other words, to stop an opponent getting around the side of the army and attacking from the side. However, they could charge. And if you got knocked down by one of those ponies, even at the trot, it's going to hurt. So cavalry, if you've got them, good. If you haven't, be worried. Now I mentioned shot, and I looked into this a lot and I can't be sure of it. But it could mean cannon, because the word in those days, cannon fired shot. Now up until about 1530, cannon were confined to ships and forts, and the only mobility were tiny little wheels that allowed them to deal with the recoil and also to manoeuvre a little bit to aim. But from about 1530 onwards, you started seeing this, something that could be taken out onto the ground somehow. It's a pretty Heath Robinson device. This is actually from somewhere in Essex, Henry's cannon in Essex. But they were around. Now my own thought is this: I think in 1583 we would not have been seeing these in Ireland. I think it's more likely that shot were these, musketeers. Now up until about the 1520s, people had bows and arrows. Very limited range, not great penetration, to be honest. But from this point onwards, we started seeing the advent of gunpowder and, for want of a better expression, a rifle. It was very heavy, very cumbersome, could not be fired without one of these monopods. Rate of fire, very slow, a lot of effort involved in reloading, and worst of all, the powder was prone to the weather. Remember, we're talking about the North Antrim Hills in April. So, question, is 2 companies of musketeers really a great weapon? Matter of opinion, we shall see. On the other side, we mentioned Redshanks. Redshanks were Scottish mercenaries. Same at the other side, the stronger, beefier men, but they were very lightly clad, very lightly armed. And their tactic was to fight as a force, yes, but broadly individually, not shoulder to shoulder, not using the impact of a force of men, but individual guys. And they really only carried a couple of weapons. They didn't carry the whole shebang. Worth mentioning that with the gallowglass, not only were they big and heavy, they had a huge admin tail. When they marched, they had a squire carrying their kit and a guy carrying all their rations. So if you had 200 or 400 of them, you had another 400 dragging along behind. This lot were much more lightly equipped. And they had evolved tactics which were entirely different to the heavy gallowglass infantry. And to this point, as far as I'm aware, the two had never met. Back we go to Dusty for a quick what's going on here. I had to look this up because I didn't know what it was. It's not a weapon, it's chain mail. It's a full-length chain mail sort of jerkin. And gallowglass infantry wore it, and Redshanks didn't. Now if you can imagine yourself with a chain mail armour on, and a sword, and a shield, and an axe, and a pike, a lot of kit, very heavy, it's very slow moving. Now, put up this slide, and in a sense I've given the game away a little bit. Because right smack bang in the middle, you've got McQuillan's grave. Now, I only put it up there because it's a reference point. Where did the battle take place? Well, I said to somebody before we started, it wasn't one engagement, it was a series of engagements. As they moved up on each other. And it was a little skirmishes between them, really sort of trying to find out what each was doing. And I think that the main part of the engagement took place over here to the right, up on what is known as the Agan-Gareth Plateau. Now, a gentleman I was talking to earlier was talking about Glencorp, which we can speak about in the end, which is further to the south. with Glen Dunn. I don't think that they would have been fighting in the valleys. Easy to move, but not easy to manoeuvre. They would have got up on high ground. It's a well-known military maxim, dominate the high ground. So my guess from what I've seen is, and if that's correct, then the main engagement took place over here somewhere. So what was the ground like? Well, first of all, let's look at that. A bit more from Dusty, which confirms the clans that were involved. And we get to the ground. Now, I took this photograph 2 years ago, and I deliberately took it because of this, in a way. The forests we see up there now are all conifer, big, thick conifer forests, but that's really post-Second World War, when there was a great need for wood in the rebuilds. In this time, in the 1580s, it was mixed, and that's what I tried to illustrate here. You'd have seen more of this sort of stuff than the thick conifers. And it's rolling countryside. Let's move on again. That is also up on the Agden-Gareth Plateau. And at a quick glance, it looks okay. Oh, just to give you some bearing, that's the Gareth Plateau in the distance. Glen Dunn is between them, and this is the Agden Plateau. I suspect that copse wasn't there in 1583. But this ground looks pretty benign. And it looks like you can get over it very easily. It isn't. Any other hill walkers around? Anybody been up there? What's it like?
Very well.
Hummocks, high hummocks, and if you're 5'6", getting over those is hard work. And then beneath you, what's it like? Soggy. Soggy. Even in June or July, it's soggy, very soggy. And that's before this happened. Just recently they started rewilding to bring the bog back. And there's a well-known saying, where there's bog cotton, and that stuff was covered in it. So you've got a situation where, in the night before the main engagement, MacDonald sends a force to raid McQuillan's camp. And he gets a bloody nose. Several of the minor chieftains were killed, and they were seen off, badly seen off. Now that must have encouraged O'Neill and McQuillan to believe that they had the upper hand here. They had a stronger force, they'd beaten them before, and they'd just given them a bloody nose. So the next morning, it is said, in one account that I've read, and there aren't many of course, they set off to finish the job, and they went up onto this. But the trouble with this is, the gallows glass infantry can't move on that. They'll sink. They certainly can't manoeuvre, much less fight. The cavalry can't get up there. If they did have cannon, you'd not get them up there. There were no roads, and the tracks were really lines following where animals had been. Nothing more, nothing less. So the going is next to impossible. The musketeers, same problem. They've got a lot of kit on. They've got to get over this ground as well. Now, there's one story that says they laid rushes on the ground and lured them on in, shades of Bannockburn 200 years before. I don't believe that happened, because if you walk around that area, there aren't any rushes anywhere. So I think they merely lured them onto that ground. And when they got them stuck on that ground, then the lightly armed and more mobile Redshanks moved in and caught them cold. And those that were killed fled. And panic is infectious. And they ran everywhere. I mentioned these two clans, and I said I'd part them down the bottom. They swore allegiance to O'Neill originally, but they turned up late and saw which way the battle was going, and they joined MacDonald. So the bad situation for O'Neill just got a whole lot worse when they turned up, and the whole thing turned into a complete shambles. And they ran down into Glencorp, and I was reminded by this gentleman here that it's the Glen of the Corpses, and huge numbers. I mean, some people have read figures of 5,000. I don't think that was true. When you see that the force levels were only in the hundreds, I doubt the casualties could have been in the thousands. And we're back here. So they've come back off the plateau, down, and poor old Rory McQuillan got cornered down here in Glenshest River and was killed and was buried where he fell. And if you walk up from Black's Farm, Paddy Black's Farm, up the valley, along the track that is actually on the Ulster Way, you will find a marker post just on the side of the track. The grave, that's there, and the grave is actually on the other bank, tucked in behind a little tree. Hard to see in the summer, easy to see in the winter. And that was where he fell and was buried. The rest continued the flight westward. And eventually poor old Hugh got cornered. And if you go along the Outer Richard Road to where the track goes off, again part of the Ulster Way, up towards Battle of Orra summit, exit the forest, track starts to bend and twist up the hill, and on the corner, which has the memorial to B-17 bomber which crashed in World War II, and walk right from there to the fence line, about 150 to 200 metres, you will find that stone tucked underneath a hummock of earth. And that purportedly is where Hugh O'Neill fell and was buried. But the flight continued up over Troston, and if you come just below the Troston on the south side here, between there and the fence line, you will come across three prominent cairns together. Now, there's no indication on what they are at all, but there is a school of thought that three minor chieftains in the O'Neill clan were caught, killed, and that's their burial place. There are no other explanations that I've come across for why those cairns are there. But the upshot of it was the MacDonalds now ruled the route. And the O'Neills never really threatened them again, until much later. I'll say something about that in a second. Sawley Boy was the big cheese. But this is 1583. He died 7 years later, 1590, at the age of 85.
The O'Neills are the from Glenmore. He didn't. I've got to a stage where I can't remember names. I've known all my life. The MacDonalds did not live at Glenmore. They lived on the Antrim coast at near Ballycastle.
Yes.
And where the caravan site is.
That's what I've heard. Yeah,
there actually is a path
yes.
through the caravan site, and you can go in and see.
Which was where Alastair tried to land
Yeah.
at the time of the Battle of Glentasy. But by the time he came there, the O'Neills had taken it, so he couldn't get on. So we went back to Scotland.
Uh-huh.
That's it. Thank you.
Got any other questions?
Is McCollum's grave near the Glencest Road?
Sorry?
Is McCollum's grave near the Glencest Road, or is it?
No, very hard to reach. It's to get to it. There are two ways in. Off the Outer Richard Road, follow one of the tracks down through Breen Forest, but it's very hard going until you drop. It's on the Ulster Way, and follow it down into the Glenshett Valley and walk along the river. It's down there. The other way is to come up from. I think it's called Glendun Road. I think it's called Glendun Road. Up to Patrick Black's farm. Go through his farmyard as far as you can go, and there's a gate that says don't go any further. You walk up about 200 metres up there. It is accessible, but you have to walk to it. You can't drive to it.
It's quite tough coming down the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's very tough to get to coming down the way.
Coming down the way is hell, isn't it?
Yeah. But worth the walk.
Well worth the walk.
Was Sawley Boy born in Ballycastle, that castle?
There are two, I've read two things. One says he was born in Dunluce, and another one says he was born in Dunvegan Castle in Islay. I have no idea which is correct. Could be either. I don't know.
Is it the one in Ballycastle, the ruin, is it Dunedin?
Well, I've only read that he was either Dunluce or in Scotland, so I haven't heard that.
I wouldn't think he would have been born in Dunluce because they
No.
didn't have
No, that's right. It's not in that. That's right. Yeah. This is where all these accounts get muddled. Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that we called that castle Dunini Castle. I think that's the way you pronounce it in Ballycastle.
I think it's probably more likely he was born in Ireland, but I don't know.
That's what I've read.
Aye.
That's what I think, because the age he was, it's really, he was born really before the MacDonalds came across, I think, around about that time, anyway.
Any more questions?
I could stop.
Just one thing, did everything settle down after that battle then?
Yes, that really ended that part of the clan war in this area. Yeah, the MacDonalds held sway, along with their allies, and the other chieftains, the other clans, were really pushed out.
The area where these battles were, there's actually a glen called, after the battles. If you're going from Cushendall towards Cushendun, you go through Glen Cork,
Yes,
the Glen of the Dead.
yes. I think that probably, now that you talk about it, we were talking earlier, I think that may apply to what happened with the Battle of Glentasy, because that was fought down nearer there. So I wonder, and the numbers you talked about suggest to me that the name Glencorp.
I can't really hear what.
Sorry, I think the name Glencorp is associated more with the Battle of Glentasy than the Battle of Orra. But
It's almost too far away.
sorry,
The Battle of Glentasy to Glencorp is too far away.
maybe, yeah, maybe
Where Glencorp starts at the bottom of Glenallen.
it does.
Goes to Cushendun.
Yeah.
To my
Yeah,
mind,
well, you're right. I mean, yes. I mean, the end of the Agrin-Gareth Plateau brings you onto the A2 around about the Vanishing Lake, which is just above Cushendun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got any more? We got any more questions? How were things dated in those days? I mean, people wouldn't have calendars. If you go back, things were very often said at the third year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Was there any, rather than...
You're quite right. I don't know how they did it, and that's why I think a lot of these accounts have all sorts of different dates because people have trouble dating it. I really don't know how it was done. But in the National Archive in Dublin, there is a reference to Hugh O'Neill's death in 1583. It doesn't say which month, but it doesn't seem to fix the year.
Right, with no other questions, can I say thank you very much to James for an excellent talk.
Yeah.
And refreshments will be ready in a second or so. There's tea, coffee, cake, biscuits and what have you. So if you just give them another minute or two to just finish.